Hey everybody, I'm Jason, and I want to invite you to chase after Jesus in 2020 with us in the Gospel of Mark. In case we haven't had a chance to meet, or if you are seeing this because the video was shared with you, I'd like to just introduce myself. Jason Burgher, I'm married to Julie. I have two boys, Caleb and Nate, and I am the pastor of Threshold Church, and we are in Westchester, which is a suburb just north of Cincinnati. So not an expert, but definitely have been walking with Jesus for a long time and studying the Word myself as a student and for the sake of being able to teach and preach. And so I would love to be a guide through the Gospel of Mark in 2020. My earnest desire would be that you would come to know Jesus or come to know Jesus better and just to serve Him more fully in our world. And so with that in mind, beyond introducing myself, I want to introduce to you John Mark. It's his gospel that we're going to be studying, and so I want to tell you a little bit about him. In order to know him, we have to go outside of his gospel because he doesn't actually claim authorship, and he doesn't talk about himself at all in his gospel. We have to piece things together from other places in the New Testament and places from church history that help us to understand a little bit more about who he was and what he was doing when he wrote his gospel. So what we know about him comes from a few different places. His mother's name was Mary, and this was obviously a different Mary than Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Mary Magdalene. There were a few Marys in the New Testament. And so his mother, Mary, we know about her from Acts chapter 12. Her home is a place where the early church is gathering. And in that account, in Jerusalem, Peter is miraculously released from prison, and he comes to the house because the church is meeting there. And so this is John Mark's mother. So we're talking the early church, hearing them preach the gospel, hearing their eyewitness accounts of Jesus, and undoubtedly seeing the early worship of the church, miracles, hearing what they prayed and what they said, certainly had an impact on his life. And so as he gets older, we'll see him again. He is named, according to Colossians chapter 4, a cousin of Barnabas. And that would explain why the very first missionary journey of the church, kind of spreading the gospel and planting churches around the world, that happens with the Apostle Paul and Barnabas. And Barnabas, John Mark's cousin, brings him along. So Mark, as a young man, goes with them on that first missionary journey. But according to Acts chapter 13, for whatever reason, Mark comes back to Jerusalem. We're not told why he leaves Paul and Barnabas, but he does. And so once we get just a little bit further along in the book of Acts, Paul and Barnabas have returned. They're reporting to the church in Jerusalem about what God has been doing in these new churches and the reception of the good news by Gentiles out in the world, and all this kind of stuff is happening. And then Paul says, we need to go again. The second missionary journey is about to begin. We're going to go around to those churches. We're going to check in. We're going to just encourage people, help them grow in their faith. And we're also going to get out even further and keep preaching, planting churches. He and Barnabas divide. They separate at this point before the second missionary journey. And the reason is that Barnabas wanted Mark to come along. He was willing to give his cousin that second chance to go at it again, to serve God and to serve Jesus. And Paul, at this point, was not having it. So that second missionary journey, Paul goes with Silas, and Barnabas takes John Mark, his cousin, under his wing, and they go off on their own. Now, Mark will circle back to Paul at some point. We know this from some of Paul's letters. As I mentioned before, Colossians, he talks about Mark in Colossians 4. He mentions Mark in Philemon, verse 24, where he calls him a faithful servant, a co-laborer in the gospel. And then toward the end of his life, in the letter of 2 Timothy chapter 4, So towards the end of his life, Paul requests that Mark will come and spend time with him. So clearly, Mark and Paul were reunited, they served together, their friendship was reconnected at some future point. Maybe more importantly, beyond Barnabas and Paul is Mark's relationship with Peter. Now clearly he spends time with Peter. We hear about it in the scriptures because in Peter's first letter, chapter 5, he refers to Mark as a son in the faith. So there's a level of intimacy and a sense of responsibility, close relationship, and that would totally mesh with what we learn from early church history and tradition that tells us that Mark and Peter served together for a number of years. In fact, one church father, whose name is Papias, writing in 125 AD, we know about him from a church historian named Eusebius. He tells us in 125 that Mark's gospel is basically communicating the narrative and the memories that Peter had. So he's telling us that Mark's gospel is almost equal to Peter's gospel. It's the preaching of Peter, the eyewitness account of one of Jesus's closest friends and one of the early leaders of the church. That's what we get when we hear Mark's gospel. So that's Mark. He was around some significant people, wasn't he? Barnabas, Paul, Peter. But the most important thing he wants to do, and the whole reason he wrote his gospel, was so that we would meet Jesus. In fact, the first verse of the Gospel of Mark says it this way: this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So it's his mission statement that he wants us to understand that Jesus is the Christ. The Christ is a figure, a reference to this Old Testament expectation of the Messiah. He's him. He's the Christ. But he is also divine. He calls him the Son of God. And so the Gospel of Mark will lay out his argument of why he believes Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of God. He wants us to meet him. He wants us to know him. He wants us to follow him, even if it leads us to dying for him. He wants us to go. So, I've introduced myself. I've introduced John Mark. He will introduce you to Jesus. Come along with us in these weeks ahead. If you're going to take this journey with us in 2020 of walking through the Gospel of Mark, you're just going to need a couple of things. First of all, you're going to need a Bible. Access a Bible either online, which is super easy to do. The YouVersion is the most popular Bible app. BibleGateway.com is a great website that I use that allows you to get into different translations of the Bible. A physical Bible is the way that I go. I'm definitely old school, so I like to have a physical Bible that I interact with. For the most part, it's with me all the time. I throw it in my bag, and when I'm working, it's out on my desk. So I'm a person that needs to interact with the physical book. I underline, I circle, I put question marks and exclamation points and cross references, and that's just how I work. I need the book. So I use the English Standard Version. That's what I'm comfortable with and what I teach and preach from. But certainly there's a range of readability that's still faithful to the original text. A lot of options. You could do the New Living Translation, the New International Version, the ESV, like me, English Standard Version. There's a Holman Christian Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible. There's so many options that are in that safe realm where it's readable, but it's faithful to the original text. That's what you're looking for, is a good balance. But it's got to be a Bible that you can read and understand what it's saying. Okay, so get a Bible. The next thing I would encourage you to do is get yourself a journal or notebook where you can begin to track your progress. And you can do it, again, in a physical form like this, or keep it as a note or a document or an Evernote where it just continues to be updated and grows as the year goes on. So when you have insights, when you make connections, when you have questions, when you have prayers, when you have thoughts about the text or about Jesus, when you really are struck of something Mark is telling you about Jesus or about what it means to follow Jesus, you write it down, you track it. Okay, that's going to happen in your journal, and it's going to keep going with you as the year rolls on. Okay, and the last thing that I would encourage you to have is a dedicated time. My plan is to release a video and then to allow for 2 weeks of time in each chapter of Mark. So 16 chapters, it's going to take us 32 or so weeks to get through the Gospel of Mark. But I would say set aside time where you are purposefully going to lock in on your reading. And the point is not to just sit and read and fly through it. Listen, I read through Mark 1 this morning, and I opened up the timer on my phone, and reading at just a normal pace of chapter 1, I read it in about 3 minutes. That's not really dedicated time. That's not what I mean. I mean time to sit and ponder, to meditate, to write, to try to chew on the word a little bit and really seek what God is speaking through it. Seeing and savoring Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. That's what I mean. It's going to take dedicated time. So whether it's the same chunk of time each week, am I always Saturday morning or certain free evening or Sunday after church or wherever it's going to be for you, dedicate the time. And I promise you it'll be worth the pursuit, because we're going to go after Jesus and we're going to know him better as we go. And by the end of 2020, we'll know him better and we'll know better how to serve him. So come along with me. If we've never met, I look forward to meeting you. Any feedback or questions, jason@thresholdchurchonline.com. You can email me or come over to Threshold and see us anytime, 10 o'clock on Sundays, okay? I hope to see you soon.